Think about what it actually took to feed a family of 8 on 30 cents. No measuring cups, no recipe book open on the counter, no backup plan. Just knowledge, the kind that got handed down in kitchens, standing next to someone who already knew how to do it. We convinced ourselves we outgrew that. Grocery stores got bigger, packaged food got cheaper, and somewhere in that deal we traded away something that actually worked. The women who built this country's food culture on dried beans and cornmeal were not making the best of a bad situation. They understood something we stopped teaching. Number 17 is the reason whole mountain communities made it through winters that cut off roads for months. Number 8 spent 2 centuries being called poor people's food before restaurants figured out they could charge $30 for it. And number 3, actual lab researchers did the math, delivers more complete nutrition % than nearly anything you currently have in your kitchen. These were not desperation meals. They were solutions, smart ones. And there was money to be made in making sure you forgot them. Subscribe before we get into it. This list might actually be useful. Number 30. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal, water, salt. You stirred it into boiling salted water and kept stirring until it thickened into something almost solid, dense, pale yellow, pulling away from the pot in heavy clumps. Poured into a loaf pan before bed, it set overnight into a block you could slice the next morning. Those slices went into a hot, greased skillet. The surface went golden and crackled. The inside stayed soft. A drizzle of sorghum on top, and you had breakfast. 1 pound of cornmeal cost 3 cents in the 1930s and covered 5 people for 2 days. Families in Appalachian hollows and across the rural South lived on this through stretches that offered nothing else. The kids who grew up eating it still talk about the sound of that spoon scraping the pot at night. We renamed it polenta, put it on a white plate, and now it costs $15. Number 29. Milk toast. Bread, whole milk, butter. Yesterday's bread torn into a bowl. Hot milk poured straight over it. A pat of butter dropped on top to melt in. Eaten with a spoon while it was still steaming. The bread went completely soft, drinking in the warm milk until the whole thing became dense and soothing in the way that only simple hot food can be. The butter left a thin richness across the surface. This showed up when someone was sick, when money had run out with days still left in the week, when cooking a real meal felt like too much. It was on tables from Tennessee to Oregon all through the Depression years. People felt slightly ashamed to admit they ate it. They also ate it, stayed warm, and made it through. Number 28. Fried green tomatoes. Green tomatoes, cornmeal, bacon drippings. Every garden ends before the plants do. First frost comes and half the tomatoes are still hard and green on the vine. You had 2 options. Leave them and lose them, or pick them and eat them. Nobody left them. Sliced a ½ inch thick, pressed into cornmeal on both sides, laid into a skillet already hot with drippings. The crust formed fast, audible, crackling, deep gold. The tomato inside got just soft enough, still with bite, the sharpness of unripe fruit cutting right through all that fat. You ate them straight from the pan. Waiting made the crust go soft, and the whole point was the crunch. This was a solution to a seasonal problem, practiced in every state where people kept gardens. The 1991 movie turned it into a charming Southern thing. Before that, it was just Tuesday. Number 27. Crackling Cornbread. Cornmeal, cracklings, water. When you render pork fat down into lard, what you get at the end, the small, dark, crunchy bits left in the pot, are cracklings. The modern kitchen throws them out. The Depression-era kitchen folded them straight into cornbread batter. What they added was fat, salt, texture, and a deep, savory flavor that plain cornbread cannot get on its own. In the oven, they softened on the outside and stayed crisp at the center, leaving little pockets of crunch through every slice. The extra fat they released made the bread itself richer and more substantial. The bottom crust came out dark and crackling. Nothing that came off that hog went to waste. Every part of it had a job. The cracklings went into the bread, and the bread fed the family. That was how it worked. Number 26. Dandelion greens with hot bacon dressing. Dandelion greens, bacon fat, apple cider vinegar. Early spring was the hardest time. The root cellar was nearly empty, the garden had not produced anything yet, and the winter had taken its toll. So you walked outside with a knife and cut what was growing in the yard. Dandelion greens, harvested young before the flowers open, before the bitterness gets too strong. You washed them and piled them in a bowl. Then you poured smoking hot bacon fat directly over them from the skillet. They collapsed immediately under the heat. A splash of apple cider vinegar went in. Steam rose sharp and tangy. Done in 5 minutes. Bitter, savory, bright with acid. Tenant farmers in Ohio and Pennsylvania had been doing this for generations before any nutritionist confirmed that dandelion greens carry more iron than spinach and more calcium than milk. They did not need confirmation. They had kids to feed and a yard full of free food. Number 25. Salt pork and beans. Pinto beans, salt pork, water. Start this in the morning. Put the dried beans in the pot with a piece of salt pork and cover it all with water. Get it simmering and leave it alone. Check it occasionally. Add water if it needs it. Come back in 6 hours. By evening, the broth will have turned from clear to golden to silky. The beans will have swollen and burst and thickened their own liquid into something that clings to a spoon. The salt pork will have given everything it had, all its fat, all its salt, into every bean in that pot. In 1935, that piece of salt pork cost 8 cents and flavored a pot that fed 8 people. With a pan of cornbread alongside to soak up the broth, it covered protein, fat, carbohydrates, and iron in a single meal that required nothing more sophisticated than patience. Coal country Kentucky ran on this. The Mississippi Delta ran on this. Working class Chicago ran on this. It was everywhere because it worked everywhere. Number 24. Vinegar pie. Eggs, sugar, apple cider vinegar. Bear with this one. Fresh fruit was seasonal and expensive. Lemons were a luxury most households could not justify. But vinegar was always in the pantry. Cheap, stable, and tart in a way that, with the right handling, could do something surprising. Whisk eggs in sugar. Add apple cider vinegar at the right ratio. Pour it into a pie shell and bake it until the center just barely sets. What comes out is smooth like custard, pale, with a brightness on the tongue that lands close enough to lemon that people who did not know what they were eating often could not tell. On a Sunday table where actual dessert was rare, this was something. Depression-era families across the South and Midwest made it through the 40s. Some were embarrassed about it and came up with other names for it. The ones who owned it knew. 3-cent ingredients, and it tasted like you spent more. Number 23. Potato pancakes. Potatoes, flour, salt. Raw potatoes, grated on the coarse side of the grater into a cloth. Then you wrung the cloth hard, squeezing out as much liquid as possible. Wet potato pancakes do not crisp. Dry ones do. That detail is the whole technique. The wrung potato went into a bowl with enough flour to hold things together and a pinch of salt. Dropped into a hot oiled pan in spoonfuls, pressed flat, left alone long enough to form a real crust on the bottom. Flipped once, crisped on the other side. Eaten with applesauce if there was any. Eaten plain if there was not. Polish grandmothers made these. German grandmothers made these. Jewish grandmothers made them at Hanukkah and called them latkes. 3 different cultures, 3 different kitchens, the same exact technique arrived at independently. Because grating leftover potatoes and frying them flat is simply the right answer to the question of what to do with potatoes that need using. Here is the part they left out of the history books. Starting in the early 1950s, American food companies funded a coordinated effort to reframe scratch cooking. Hired writers published articles in women's magazines under names that were not their own, explaining that cooking from scratch was time-consuming, inconsistent, and frankly, beneath the modern housewife. Radio shows sponsored by shortening brands and canned soup companies reinforced the message. Convenience foods were positioned as smarter, safer, and more appropriate for the era. Within a decade, it had worked. Women who knew how to cook an entire nutritious meal from 3 ingredients started reaching for cans instead. And when those women aged out of the kitchen, the knowledge they carried did not get passed down. It was not written anywhere. It just stopped. Pinto beans and salt pork are still cheaper than canned soup. They still taste better and feed more people. The only thing that actually changed is that one generation got convinced the old way was inferior. The companies selling the cans did very well off that conviction. Number 22. Hoover Stew macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs. Nobody was kind when they named this one. Herbert Hoover presided over the start of the Depression, and the name stuck to this dish like something that would not wash off. Boil macaroni, open a can of stewed tomatoes, slice in hot dogs if you had them. Simmer everything together until the pasta had soaked up some of the tomato and turned orange-pink. It was not elegant. It was hot, quick, and a 10-year-old could make it without supervision, while the parents were out looking for any available work. Municipal relief kitchens in New York and Chicago ladled out versions of this to thousands of people a day at the worst points of the 1930s. Kids who ate it in those lines grew up and remembered it as something warm their mother gave them, not as evidence of what had gone wrong. The act of being fed, even in a church basement, carried its own kind of meaning. Number 21. Pot Liquor and Cornbread. Collard greens, fatback, cornbread. When you cook collard greens low and slow with fatback, something happens to the liquid in the pot. The vitamins and minerals that cook out of the greens do not disappear. They end up in the broth. By the time the greens are done, dark and collapsed and impossibly tender, the liquid surrounding them is almost black, deeply smoky, and nutritionally dense in a way the greens alone are not. That broth is pot liquor. You poured it into a bowl, crumbled cornbread over the top, and ate it with a spoon. Kids scraped the bowl. Adults sometimes drank it straight. People outside the communities that made this called it the lowest food on the Southern table. Nutritionists who have since studied it describe it as one of the most mineral-rich preparations in traditional American cooking: iron, calcium, folate, fat-soluble vitamins. The people eating it already knew it kept them going. They did not need a study to confirm it. Number 20. Tomato gravy. Canned tomatoes, flour, bacon drippings. When there were no eggs and nothing in the smokehouse, there was still usually a can of tomatoes. Flour cooked in drippings until it turned the color of a paper bag. Then the tomatoes went in all at once, and you stirred fast to pull the roux into the liquid. It thickened within minutes into something tangy and savory and brick red, with a depth that made no sense given what went into it. It went over biscuits. It went over cornbread. It went over cold, fried mush. It went over whatever was on the plate that needed something on top. Southern farmhouses kept a can of stewed tomatoes in the pantry the way northern households kept a box of crackers, as a guarantee. One can in the cupboard meant a meal was always possible, even when nothing else was. Number 19. Cornbread and Buttermilk. Cornbread, cold buttermilk, salt. Not a recipe, a habit. Leftover cornbread crumbled into a glass or a wide bowl, cold buttermilk poured over until it covered, a pinch of salt. Eaten with a long spoon before the bread absorbed too much liquid and lost all its texture. The cornbread soaked up the buttermilk and became something between porridge and bread pudding. Cool, dense, slightly sour, filling in a way that required no cooking and no heat source on a sweltering summer evening. Farm workers across the South and Midwest ate this after long days in the field. It took 30 seconds to prepare. It was cold when cold was welcome. Old men who are still alive recall making it standing at the counter, eating it in the kitchen before the sun had fully set. They built lives on food like this. The following generations built lives on drive-thrus and are paying for it medically in ways that are becoming impossible to ignore. Number 18. Bread pudding. Stale bread, whole milk, eggs. No household with any sense let bread go hard without a plan for it. Torn into rough pieces and placed in a baking dish, the stale bread got covered with a mixture of warmed milk and beaten eggs, with a shake of cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin was not empty. Pressed down until everything had soaked through. then into the oven. 20 minutes later, the house smelled like something worth sitting down for. The edges puffed and browned. The center stayed just set, soft and custardy, still trembling slightly when the dish came out. This was the Sunday dessert, the birthday treat. The way a kitchen that could not afford waste still managed to produce something that felt like an occasion. Upscale Southern restaurants now listed on dessert menus for $12 a serving. They do not explain that it was invented as a solution to not wasting bread. Number 17. Dried apple stack cake. Dried apples, flour, lard. Appalachian winters were serious. Roads became impassable. Root sellers had to carry families through months of no fresh food. Apples got dried in late summer, peeled, sliced thin, spread out until they shrank to papery rings, then packed into cloth sacks and stored. In winter, those rings went back into water, rehydrated, and cooked down into a thick, spiced filling. Separately, rounds of simple flour and lard dough got baked like cookies until firm. The rounds stacked with filling between each layer, the whole construction wrapped and left overnight. By morning, the layers had absorbed the moisture from the filling and pressed together into a single, dense, sliceable cake. At weddings in the 1920s, guests brought their own baked layers as contributions. The family assembled them at the reception. More layers meant the bride was well liked. 12 layers was high praise. No refrigeration, no baking powder, kept for 2 weeks, fed whoever came through the door. Number 16. Fried salt pork with pan gravy. Salt pork, flour, water. Salt pork is cured pork belly with no smoke and no sweetness, cheaper than bacon, cheaper than ham, available at every general store in rural America through the first half of the 20th century. Sliced thin, pressed in flour, placed fat side down in a hot skillet. The fat rendered out fast. The flour coating crisped and browned. The lean parts darkened and went dense. Pulled the pork out, left all the drippings. Added more flour to the fat. Stirred until it came together into a paste, then poured in water, just water, and stirred until it became gravy. Thick, pale, salty. This is white gravy. It did not come from a recipe. It came from a skillet that could not be wasted. Tenant farmers, railroad workers, mill hands. Anyone who had to work physically and could not afford to skip a meal ate this. The gravy went over biscuits, over grits, over whatever else was on the plate. In 2017, a research team did something nobody in the food industry wanted publicized. They put traditional Depression-era meals through full nutritional analysis. The results were not what the marketing around modern convenience food had spent decades implying. A serving of pinto beans cooked with salt pork, paired with cornbread made from whole ground meal, met nearly the full daily nutritional requirements of an adult man doing heavy physical labor. Protein, fiber, iron, calcium, B vitamins, covered. For under 10 cents a serving in 1935. The team described the traditional Southern diet of beans, greens, and cornbread as nutritionally superior to the processed foods that replaced it after the war. Not adequate, not comparable, superior. The women who fed families on these meals were not doing the best they could with poor options. They were doing it right. The story we told ourselves for 50 years, that modern food was progress and old food was poverty, made a lot of companies wealthy and left a lot of people less healthy. The math was never actually in our favor. Number 15. Sirup Sandwich. White bread, butter, cane syrup. Before you write this off, understand what it actually was. Refined white sugar was expensive and treated carefully through most of the Depression. Cane syrup, ribbon cane, sorghum, whatever the local variety was, cost very little, was made nearby, and was sweet enough for every practical purpose. Spread butter on a slice of bread, pour thick amber syrup over it, fold the bread over. That was breakfast before school. That was what went into the lunch pail. That was the afternoon snack when the pantry offered nothing else. The women who made these sandwiches did not make them with apology. They were giving their children what they had. The people who ate them as children do not remember being shortchanged. They remember their mother's hands. That is the part of the recipe that does not show up in any ingredient list. Number 14. Bean soup with ham hock. Navy beans, ham hock, water. 1 ham hock and 1 pound of dried navy beans. Total cost in the 1930s, about $1.40, with water free from the tap. In the morning, everything went into the pot and the flame went low. By the time the day was over, the kitchen smelled like somewhere worth being. The beans had absorbed the smoky, salty depth of the hock until every single one of them tasted like there was far more pork in the pot than there actually was. The broth had gone from clear to golden to something thick and serious. 12 people could eat from this. It was dinner on Sunday, lunch on Monday, still good on Tuesday with a little added water. Miners ate this. Immigrants ate this. Women whose husbands had not come back from the war ate this and fed their children on it. The United States Senate cafeteria has served a version of bean soup every single day for over a century. They do not make a habit of explaining the origins. Number 13. Egg drop soup. Eggs, broth, salt. After the chicken had been roasted and the meat eaten and the carcass picked clean, most kitchens still had work left to do. The bones, the neck, the bits nobody could eat directly. Those went into a pot of water and simmered until the liquid turned golden and gelatinous. Strain it. What you have is real broth, made from what would otherwise have been thrown out. Bring it back to a simmer. Beat 2 eggs, pour them in slowly while stirring, and watch them cook instantly into pale yellow and white ribbons floating through the liquid. Add salt. That is the meal. Italian grandmothers stirred in Parmesan and called it stracciatella. Jewish grandmothers served it on Friday evenings. Southern grandmothers named it whatever seemed right and made it work. Different names, different tables, identical thinking. The bones still have something to give. Use it. Number 12. Fried potatoes and onions. Potatoes, onions, bacon drippings. Payday was Friday. On Tuesday, when the money was functionally gone and the week had more days left in it than the budget did, you went to what the pantry still had. A bag of potatoes, a string of onions hanging from the ceiling, the drippings tin on the back of the stove, hot skillet, layer of sliced potatoes laid flat, left alone long enough to start actually browning against the iron rather than just steaming. Sliced onions went on top. Lid on, low heat, patience. When the lid came off, the onions had gone golden and sweet and soft, and the bottom layer of potatoes was caramelized and dark. Salt and pepper, nothing else. This started as a side dish. On the nights there was no main, it became the main. The kids who grew up eating this on pre-payday Fridays talk about it like it was a treat. The iron and the heat and the thyme did something to those 2 cheap vegetables that made them worth remembering. Number 11. Crackers and milk. Saltine crackers, whole milk, salt. This one requires no technique and very little explanation. You broke crackers into a bowl, poured cold milk over them, added a pinch of salt, and ate it with a spoon. That was supper on the nights when supper was whatever happened to be in the cabinet at 9 o'clock with the stove already cold. There is something specific about the way old men remember this. Not vague nostalgia, actual specific memory. The particular bowl, the overhead bulb, the way the crackers went soft and slightly grainy in the milk before they dissolved completely. The way a hungry stomach accepted it without complaint. It asked for nothing from you. No cooking, no planning, no pretense. It was just enough. On the nights it appeared, being just enough was exactly what was needed. Something got lost between one generation and the next, and it happened faster than anyone noticed. Picture a woman born in rural Georgia in the early 1930s. She raised her family on a farm that produced most of what they ate. They ground their own corn. They dried apples on screens in August. They kept a hog every year and used every part of it without debate. She could tell you, without calculating, exactly how many meals came from a single ham hock. She knew that the yard grew free food every spring. She understood that dried beans were the best value in the store, and that the liquid they cooked in was worth keeping. Her daughter moved to town in the early 1960s and discovered canned soup. Her grandchildren learned to cook from package instructions. Her great-grandchildren ordered delivery on their phones. The knowledge this woman carried was never written down because there was never a reason to write it down. It lived in doing it, in standing next to someone who already knew, in the repetition of the same tasks through the same seasons, year after year. When that chain of proximity broke, the knowledge did not go into storage somewhere. It simply ceased to exist in that family. That is not a natural progression. That is a specific and measurable loss. Number 10. Wacky Cake. Flour, cocoa powder, white vinegar. No eggs, no butter, no milk. This one goes by a few names: Depression Cake, Crazy Cake, Wacky Cake, and all of them gesture at the same essential strangeness. It should not work, and it does. During wartime rationing, eggs and butter and milk were restricted or scarce. Cakes were not optional. Birthdays still happened. Sundays still called for something. So bakers found the workaround. White vinegar reacts with baking soda to produce carbon dioxide, which leavens the batter the way eggs would. Oil, combined with flour and cocoa, provides moisture. The chemistry is different from a traditional cake, but the result is the same. Dark, dense, genuinely good chocolate cake that came out of a pan with no eggs and no dairy. You mix the batter directly in the baking pan, poured vinegar into a well in the dry ingredients, added baking soda, watched it fizz, mixed fast, got it into the oven before the reaction burned out. It worked every time. The people baking it understood the principle even if they did not have the scientific vocabulary for it. Number 9. Milk gravy and biscuits. Flour, whole milk, pan drippings. If there is a single preparation that defines the gap between how Southern poverty food was perceived and what it actually delivered, this might be it. Flour cooked in whatever drippings were in the skillet until the raw smell cooked off and the paste had gone a shade darker. Milk added all at once, stirred constantly until smooth and thick. Poured over split biscuits made from the same 3 ingredients in different ratios. The whole process took 20 minutes and required nothing refrigerated, nothing fresh, and nothing that could not sit on a shelf through an entire winter. It was breakfast when the temperature dropped and the morning felt hard. It was supper when the smokehouse had nothing left and the hens had stopped producing. 3 ingredients that any farmhouse kept in constant supply, used together in a way that produced something warm and filling and genuinely satisfying. That is a harder thing to achieve than it sounds. Number 8. Pinto beans and cornbread. Pinto beans, fatback, cornmeal. If you had to point to one combination that defined how a region fed itself through a century of difficulty, this would be it for Appalachia and the rural South. There was not a coal camp or a tobacco farm or a hill county anywhere in that stretch of America where this pot was not on the stove on a regular basis. Every day, somewhere, someone had beans going with a piece of fatback and cornbread coming out of the oven. The beans cooked until they burst and thickened their own broth into something that clung to the bread when you broke it in. The cornbread came out crackly on the bottom, tender through the middle. You ate it from whatever bowl was available at a table that usually had more people than chairs. The families who kept making this ate it into old age. The families who got embarrassed about it and switched to more modern alternatives are the ones who will tell you now that their health went sideways somewhere in middle age. Number 7. Fried Mush. Cornmeal mush, grease, cane syrup. This is different enough from plain mush to deserve its own entry. The previous night's mush was the starting point, chilled in a loaf pan until completely solid, which took the whole night. In the morning, you sliced it like bread, half an inch thick, and laid the slabs in a hot, greased skillet. Then you waited. Not light browning, a real crust, dark gold, crackling when you pressed it with a spatula, audibly different from raw mush. Flipped once, crisped on the other side, slid onto the plate. Cane syrup drizzled on top pooled into the ridges and soaked into the crust while it was still hot. It ate like something more than it was. The outside crackled. The inside was soft and dense and hot. The syrup made the corn flavor bloom in a way that plain mush never quite managed. 1 pound of cornmeal did breakfast for 6 people, 3 mornings in a row. Nothing in the history of American breakfast has ever beaten that math.
Number 6. Water pie. Water, flour, sugar. This is the one that sits at the furthest edge of what these kitchens could do. When there was genuinely nothing, not beans in the bin, not eggs, not a scrap of fruit, and company was arriving and the idea of an empty table was not acceptable, some women made pie from water. Water, flour, sugar, a scrape of butter if any remained, a drop of vanilla if the bottle was not empty. Mixed into a thin, pale liquid and poured into a prepared shell. Baked until the center set, not firm but set, translucent and slightly wobbly, honest about what it was. It was sweet. It was served on plates. It was pie. The woman who could look at water and flour and sugar and decide that was sufficient for a dessert, not out of delusion but out of sheer refusal to be beaten by circumstance, was operating at a level most of us will never have to reach. The fact that it worked every time she made it is its own kind of remarkable. Number 5. Rice and gravy. White rice, pan drippings, water. 200 years of Louisiana working-class cooking starts here. White rice, cooked until each grain is separate. Whatever drippings the skillet held, combined with flour and stretched with water into a thin, dark, savory gravy, poured over the rice. When meat had been cooked earlier, the gravy carried its flavor. When no meat had touched the pan recently, the gravy was just browned fat and water and flour, and that was still enough, still dark, still savory, still deeply satisfying in the way that anything simple and hot tends to be when you are actually hungry. Rice was the cheapest carbohydrate available. It held flavor well and filled stomachs reliably. The pan drippings were free because the pan was going to get dirty anyway. This combination, repeated across generations and geographies, produced people who lived long and worked hard and did not spend money they did not have on food that did not feed them. Number 4. Bean bread. Cooked beans, cornmeal, water. This knowledge predates every other recipe on this list by centuries. Cherokee grandmothers were making bean bread long before any European kitchen existed on this continent. Cooked pinto beans, soft, fully broken down, folded into cornmeal dough and shaped by hand. Some versions were wrapped in corn husks and cooked over fire. Some were shaped into rounds and boiled in water until the meal had set completely around the beans. No butter added, no salt beyond what the beans carried, no side dish required. The beans provided protein, the corn provided carbohydrate. Together they formed a complete, portable, self-sufficient meal that required no refrigeration and kept through conditions that would have ruined most modern food. Through the forced removal, through the Depression, through federal commodity programs that pushed white flour and nutritionally hollow canned goods, the grandmothers who still knew how to make bean bread kept making it. They passed it to their daughters. The knowledge held. Everything they understood about those two ingredients together was correct. It took the rest of the world an embarrassingly long time to confirm it. Number 3. Dried pea soup. Dried split peas, ham bone, water. Here is a preparation that 3 different groups figured out independently. Medieval European peasants, American Depression-era households, and World War II home front cooks all arrived at split pea soup through the same logic. When you have a bone left from something else and a bag of dried legumes, you have a meal, a serious one. 1 ham bone, Sunday's dinner already finished and the meat already eaten. 1 pound of split peas, water. 3 hours on a low flame and you barely need to pay attention. Split peas do something that most dried legumes do not. They dissolve. They break down completely when cooked long enough, thickening the liquid they sit in from thin broth into something dense and opaque that coats the back of a spoon. The ham bone, over 3 hours, gives everything, collagen, marrow, smoke, salt, into the surrounding liquid. Researchers measured this specific soup in 2019. Complete protein from the legume and bone combination.
more dietary fiber per bowl than almost any other food measured. Iron, B vitamins, potassium, present in meaningful amounts. A full working day's worth of nutrition in a pot that cost 14 cents in 1940.
Number 2. Fatback and collard greens.
Fatback, collard greens, black pepper. Fatback is not bacon. It has not been smoked, it has not been sweetened, and it does not behave like bacon in the pot. It is pure, salted pork fat from the back of the hog, preserved without further processing, cheap, and extremely effective at one specific job: slowly releasing its fat and salt into whatever it cooks alongside. One piece of fatback dropped into a pot of raw collard greens with enough water to cover, and a heavy measure of black pepper. High heat to bring it to a boil, then reduced to the gentlest possible simmer for 2 full hours. The greens slowly lost their structure, their bright color, their resistance. They collapsed and darkened and absorbed what the fatback steadily gave off. The water reduced and concentrated. The pot liquor at the end was nearly black. What came out was not gentle. It was intensely bitter, intensely salty, soft in a way that offered no resistance at all, rich with rendered fat, and dark in a way that announced itself before it reached the table. This dish originated in the kitchens of enslaved people in the American South, made from the parts of the hog that were considered worthless by people who had the option of rejecting them. Those cooks took what they were given and produced something so specific and so deeply flavored that it became the foundation of an entire culinary tradition that is still alive and still celebrated 200 years later. That is the measure of what happened in those kitchens.
Number 1. Cornbread, buttermilk, and raw onion. Hot cornbread, cold buttermilk, raw onion. No technique here. No preparation beyond slicing an onion. This is just 3 things on a table at the end of the day. A wedge of cornbread still warm from the oven. A glass of cold buttermilk poured full. A raw onion sliced thin while you stood at the counter. You eat a piece of the cornbread. You drink some buttermilk. When the richness of the bread and the tang of the milk meet cutting through, you take a bite of raw onion, sharp and immediate, and suddenly you can start again. Across the rural South and Appalachia and every other region where working people came home tired to kitchens that had stretched every dollar as far as it could go, this combination closed out the day. Not because it was ceremonial, because it was always there. Because cornmeal and buttermilk and a garden onion were things a household could almost always manage to have. The fat in the cornbread, the acid of the buttermilk, the heat of the raw onion. Together they made something complete out of 3 things that cost almost nothing. The people who ate this at the end of their hardest days were not settling. They were eating what their kitchens had perfected over generations. They went to sleep knowing the family was fed. They got up the next morning and did it again. For years. For decades. They understood something about food and value and intelligence that we are still, slowly, working our way back toward. Pick one from this list and make it this week. Just one. Start a pot of split pea soup on Sunday morning and leave it alone until dinner. Fry cold mush in a skillet Saturday morning and put syrup on it and see if it does not beat anything that comes out of a box. Make milk gravy from the drippings in last night's pan and pour it over biscuits, and then decide for yourself what we gave up. These meals came from people who did not have the option of wasting anything. That constraint made them precise. It made them resourceful. It made them effective in ways that a fully stocked modern kitchen often is not, because abundance does not teach the same lessons that scarcity does. We spent the better part of a century being sold the idea that convenience was an upgrade. The nutrition got worse. The cost went up. The knowledge that made those old meals work disappeared from most households in the span of a single generation. The companies that sold the replacement products did extremely well. The rest of us made a trade that was not as favorable as we were told it would be. Drop a comment and tell me what your grandmother actually cooked. Not what she made for guests, what she made on a regular Tuesday with whatever the kitchen had. Those are the meals I want to hear about.